Chapter 7 Chatterdale. Malagarth theorem! Exclaimed the prince, that old rascal, he must have it. I'm sorry? Said Abigail, who believed that, at last, she had come upon a word that she couldn't understand. What is a Malagarth theorem? He is not a what, but a who, said the prince, and this particular who, is a bookworm, with a bad habit of keeping the books I lent him, if I let him get away with it. Anyway, he must have it. I've looked everywhere, the library, the terrarium, the solarium, the aquarium, the herbarium, the other library, the wine cellar, the catacombs. I didn't even know this place had catacombs. It was full of dwarf skeletons, absolutely terrifying. My point is that I couldn't find my book on image bearers anywhere. Malagarth theorem must have borrowed it. Fern, pack a bag, we're taking the cart to Chatterdale for lunch. Oh good, Malagarth theorem is my favorite, he always tells the best stories, said Fern. Abigail was also excited for a trip into town, because it would be her first time meeting new people since she had come to stay with the prince. Fern had Abigail help her pack a picnic basket with salted meats, orange cider, some raisin cakes, biscuits and speckled eggs which were nearly as big as an ostrich's. After Fern had realized that Abigail did not intend her any harm, Fern scarcely left Abigail's side. For I doubt there would be anything quite as exciting as your own pet monster to bring with you everywhere if you were in Fern's place. And even though Benjamin insisted that Abigail was neither a monster, nor a pet, Fern didn't pay him much mind. For Abigail's part, if it meant the Fern was no longer afraid of her, she didn't care much either way. Oh Abigail, I nearly forgot, when we're in town I'm afraid that you'll have to wear this, said the prince as he tossed her a black choker with a brass ring hanging from the front. As they left the house, it was about that time in the mid-morning where everything is starting to warm up and the dew from the night before is disappearing from the grass, but it still is not dry enough for any of the trails to get dusty yet. Abigail did not have a watch, but if she had to guess, I suppose she would say it was about 9:30 in the morning. As soon as they had rounded the barn enough to see the old cart, Fern made an initial dash towards it. There was no reason for this, of course, except for the fact that when children are in well enough spirits they find occasion to run just about everywhere. Abigail followed her to the cart more slowly since she was carrying the basket, and Benjamin headed to the stalls to collect Morris. By the time the prince had brought Morris to the cart, Fern was sitting on the front bench, which fit her stature much better than Benjamin's, strumming her fingers impatiently. Since there wasn't room for three on the bench, Abigail was more than happy to climb in the back of the cart facing backwards. Finally Morris was attached, and with a flick of the reins the mule began pulling them to town. Since Abigail was facing the wrong way to concern herself with how the trip was progressing, she instead lied back and stared at the clouds as they went along. As she did, she almost felt like she was back home, gazing up at the open sky that could have been above any plain, even the one that surrounded her little farmhouse. And though she deeply longed for the next time she looked away from that deep blue sky to find herself heading down familiar roads on the way home, it was, unfortunately, never the case. A quick glance down revealed Benjamin's coat tails draped over the bench in front of her, dispelling her fantasy quickly. Just seeing the strange landscape around her reminded her how far from home she really was. The canvas of the blue sky was dappled with slow, massive clouds, which wandered lazily towards the horizon. So just as she did back home, she imagined shapes and animals in them, and dreamed of massive castles that might sit upon their tops, hidden from all eyes below. After about 20 minutes, Fern left her bench and climbed in the back next to Abigail, and joined her in cloud watching, resting her little head on Abigail's stomach. "Oh look, another traveler," pointed out Benjamin, interrupting the silence they had so far been sharing. Abigail lazily sat up and she saw someone coming from a long way off in the opposite direction. The strangers rode upon a wooden cart that looked like a circus train being pulled by 6 well-groomed geldings. Unlike Morris, they were obviously show horses, for they prefer high-stepping over trotting or walking. There were 3 carts behind them. The first looked like a wooden steam engine with a calliope in the engineer's cab. Behind it was a carriage that looked like a lion's cage full of carved figurines and dangling marionettes. The last carriage was a caboose with some lodging and a door that looked like a storefront at the very back. If the idea of a circus wasn't exciting enough, the whole train was painted with snowflakes and hung in holly and garlands, making it very clear that it was a Christmas train. "Wood dwarfs!" gasped Fern excitedly, scrambling from her spot next to Abigail back to the bench, and then crawling across her brother to get a better look. Benjamin was noticeably less enthusiastic about the travelers. The calliope piped a happy tune of that particular sort that are made just for calliopes to let children know something fun and exciting is coming their way. "They have the absolute best toys," blurted out Fern to Abigail, but then quickly corrected, "the best apart from yours of course dear brother," patting his hand reassuringly. "Well, it's just that I don't make toys, I make educational tools. They entertain and inform. Besides, everyone knows that dwarves' toys are far too flimsy, and break right after you bring them home," said Benjamin, justifying himself. Honestly though, there was something about wood dwarves that set Benjamin uneasy. Most likely it was their constant obsession with wood carving which made him feel nervous, but I would say that is perfectly justifiable for anyone made entirely of wood. As the carriage came closer, Abigail saw that it was driven by an elderly couple, a man and his wife, dressed in forest green lederhosen. The old man had rosy cheeks and a bare face. On top of his head he wore a green hat with a long pheasant's feather coming from the side. Strangely, however, the two looked more like a pair of children play acting as an old couple than really old. They both appeared very lanky and thin, like children right after a growth spurt, that really awkward age where they are almost too tall for their own good, and would most likely fall over except for the fact that their feet grew quite large at the same time. The only thing that gave away their true age was some slight wrinkles on their faces, and their shock white hair. Their faces were kind, and both wore small glasses in front of their striking blue eyes. This was what Abigail remembered most of the dwarves, their vibrant blue-grey eyes. "Grandfather," cried out Fern, "grandfather, grandfather," she repeated. When the dwarves heard this they slowed their carriage to a stop next to the prince's cart. Benjamin of course gave Fern a very annoyed look that would have suited a cat that was halfway through receiving a bath. "Oh brother, you old humbug, this is Abigail's first time seeing wood dwarves, where is your holiday spirit?" pestered Fern. "About 5 months in the past, along with the holidays," said the prince. "Oh come now, have a heart brother, who knows if Abigail will be here next Christmas? Let's buy her something now," urged Fern. "Fine," said the prince, giving in, "but just one thing, and be quick about it, we do have a schedule to keep you know." "Oh thank you," said Fern, already grabbing Abigail's hand, so she would come look at the cart with her. "This is a wood dwarf caravan, Abby, they come to town for the holidays every year to share the toys they've made with good boys and girls," said Fern proudly, for she was very happy indeed to be the first person to explain to Abigail about something that was as important as Christmas. "You have to call them grandmother and grandfather to get the really good toys, but no one actually believes it," explained Fern. And then ran up and began doting over the old couple. "Oh grandfather, it's so good to see you again. I was just telling my friends how you make the very best toys. I hope you remembered to make me something especially wonderful this year. Oh, and grandmother, I've missed you terribly. You remember your little Fern, don't you?" asked Fern kindly. The couple was a bit taken back, for they had seen a good many clockworks before, but none with presence of mind enough to ask them for a gift for the holidays. Abigail was a little surprised too. "Have you met these dwarves before?" Abigail whispered. "No, you just have to act like they're your real grandparents. It's like a tradition or something," whispered back Fern. "Oh, of course, dearest Fern, how could we forget our little granddaughter from," started Grandfather Dwarf, deciding that perhaps if he cleaned his glasses with his handkerchief the answer might come to him. "Greenland," whispered Benjamin to the dwarf after a bit of an awkward silence. "Yes, quite right, Greenland," continued the dwarf. "What can I do for you, my child?" "Well, grandfather, it's my friend. She never had a Christmas before, but she has been ever so good, and I was hoping you might have a toy to spare her even though the holidays are a long way off, and grandmother, maybe you could let her try some hot cocoa too," said Fern. "Oh, of course, dear one," said the grandmother as she went to their storage carriage to get the hot cocoa. "And where is this friend, my dear?" asked the dwarf, looking intentionally past Abigail, who was standing in plain sight. "Is she hiding? Tell her she has nothing to fear from old grandpa." "What do you mean?" "She's right here," said Fern, pushing Abigail forward to present her to Grandfather Dwarf. A look of surprise laced with the slightest tinge of disgust came over the old dwarf's face, but being well versed in the irrational fancies of children, he was only off-put for a moment. "Oh my, of course, this dryad is your friend. Are you sure she would really like a toy? How about I just give you something instead, and she can watch you play with it," said the dwarf, who was getting a little unsettled by the whole situation, and regretting he had stopped altogether at this point. "No," insisted Fern, "this is Abigail's first Christmas. The present is for Abigail." "Oh my, Abigail, you mean to say that you've named it?" said Grandfather Dwarf, taking out his handkerchief again and dabbing his forehead nervously. Then he looked to Benjamin for a cue of what he should do next. Benjamin gave the dwarf a shrug, indicating that things were bound to go much better if they all just played along. Fern, meanwhile, was trying her best to teach Abigail to say "toy please grandfather" in Atlantean, and hold her hands out in front of herself. Abigail's attempt, however, came out sounding much more like "toy now, Grand Pickles" than anything else. Again the dwarf looked nervously to Benjamin for guidance, who held up two shks behind the girls as the dwarf's reward for cooperating, which was much more than people usually spent in his shop. "Ah yes, of course Abigail, right you are, she must have a toy," said the dwarf, snapping back into character. Just then, Grandmother Dwarf bustled in with a set of porcelain cups and a chocolate pot on a silver tray. Up until this point she was taking the visit in much better spirits than her husband, but as she walked past the prince and saw the big black scar on his face, she became petrified with fear. Frozen, she just stood there, not moving an inch. She would have stayed there indefinitely if she hadn't become so frightened that the tray she carried began to rattle noticeably. At the noise, Benjamin's eyes slowly shifted to the old woman, and suddenly the old woman noticed he was watching her through the corner of his eye. To this point she was considering running, if her legs would work, but when she noticed she was being watched, her only option of escape was lost. She decided to pretend that she hadn't noticed anything about the prince at all, but her shaking tray gave her away. Luckily for her, she was close enough to the table that she was able to set it down before it caused too much of a commotion. "Who's ready for some cocoa?" stuttered Grandmother, trying to regain her composure. "Our grandmother, you've come just in time. We're celebrating Abigail's first Christmas," said Grandfather Dwarf, "Abigail being the dryad, of course." "Goodness, they've named it?" asked Grandmother. "It would seem that way, yes," said Grandfather. "Oh my," said Grandmother. So at Fern's insistence they all sat down for a cup of Grandmother Dwarf's cocoa. Fern was very excited to see Abigail's reaction. Though it wasn't half bad. Abigail had tasted better cocoa before, but she didn't think this was the time or place to bring it up, nor the fact that she had enjoyed many Christmases back home with her family. After they had finished, Grandfather took them into the carriage with all the marionettes. There was, in fact, a good number of wooden toys in the cart besides the marionettes, for which Abigail was grateful, since those dolls gave her a rather eerie feeling. Each toy was intricately carved and also magical, so they moved back and forth or capered about on their own, and though all miniatures of wood, they all acted very lifelike. The floor looked like a wondrous zoo with apes, catamounts, elephants and the like, all made of wood. They would do a particular action for a second or two, stop, then go back to where they were when they began and repeat the whole thing again. They all had a yellow aura about them that sparkled from deep in their tiny center, which was a clear sign that they were enchanted with some sort of pixie dust. Never seeing anything so wonderful, Abigail was simply captivated, especially by the lion, who stood up, roared, and then shook his mane to and fro, as bright glimmers broke free from the lion and fell like twinkling sparks, vanishing right before they hit the ground. He looked so proud and regal, Abigail must have watched him repeat his roar at least 20 times. Fern, however, took no interest in any of the toys before them. "Arg, don't be fooled by the yellow ones, those are baby toys," she whispered to Abigail. "They're nothing compared to the blue ones." "Grandfather, is this all you have?" asked Fern, clasping her hands before herself and twisting her toe into the ground before her. "I was hoping for something a bit more blue." The dwarf seemed to know exactly what Fern was talking about, but would not have been forthcoming if he could satisfy the girls with something lesser. He then led them back to his counter and pulled on a felt rope to reveal a second menagerie of wooden animals, each in their own glass cage behind a curtain. These were very carefully crafted, and truly the dwarf's masterpieces. They glowed with a light blue aura, just as the others had a yellowish tint. "Now child, before I even show you these creatures, I must warn you that owning one is a responsibility, not a game. They need to be treated with respect," said Grandfather, who to his credit held each and every one of the creatures very dear. These animals were different than the others in another way too. Whereas the yellow gorilla proudly beat his chest, the one in this case just sat with his hand up against the glass of his cage. He seemed very sad. Some of the creatures paced back and forth nervously. The blue lions were sleeping. At first Abigail was confused as to why anyone would prefer these toys to the others, but decided to inspect them closer to see what the fuss was about. Picking up a case with a little wooden mouse inside, she noticed that instead of clunking to one end or the other of its case as a toy would, it put out its little feet as wide as it could and slowly skidded to the lower end of the case. Very curious, thought Abigail. Then she tapped on the glass and saw the mouse was following her finger with its eyes. As her finger came closer, the mouse's little nose twitched back and forth. "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed Abigail, "they're alive." "Actually they're clockworks," corrected Benjamin. "They were once alive, and still have the mind of a living thing, but a body of metal and gears." "Like Fern?" asked Abigail. "Well, yes and no," said Benjamin. "Fern is special. You'll never meet another clockwork like her." "That's right," said Fern proudly, "I'm special." "So did the dwarf make any of these?" asked Abigail. "I doubt it. You see the blue glow there? It's a dead giveaway. It means they're made with Johann's oil. Apart from those in the East, very few have learned to work with such things. Most of these are just relics from a long time ago," explained the prince, "but he did most likely carve the wood on the outside." The whole time Benjamin was been talking, Abigail was holding the little mouse in her hands, occasionally stroking its head with her thumbs. She had very much decided that if she were to take anything from the dwarf's shop, it would be him. "Oh, how cute," said Fern, looking at the little mouse in Abigail's hands. "He definitely likes you." Since Benjamin seemed to know a good deal about clockworks, Abigail flooded him with questions about all he knew regarding the East and these strange creatures. Fern, already knowing as much about clockworks as she wanted to, decided to use the time they were talking to have a bit of a look around the rest of the carriage instead. When Abigail was satisfied that all her questions about clockworks were answered for the moment, the prince and Abigail took little Ferdinand, as she had decided to name him, to be purchased at the counter. As they walked past Fern amongst the yellow trinkets, she paid them no notice, for her eyes were fixed on a figure in the corner. The doll Fern stared at was a 6-inch tall, beautiful, young Decidueye girl. She curtsied and then waltzed forward as with an invisible partner. She moved so joyously and effortlessly you could almost hear the music to which she danced. As her dance repeated over and over, her long arms and legs flowed smoothly and gracefully in a way Fern's awkwardly short little legs never could. The girl's face was charmingly expressive, it was pensive, yet whimsical, and shone brightly with joy in a way Fern's dull metal shell never would. As Fern noticed that her brother had come near, she turned to take his big strong hand in her smaller ones, then she looked up intently with her two mechanical eyes. As emotion welled up inside of her, all she could say was, "Please brother, for me. Please," and then looking down at the ground she added, "It really would mean the world to me." I doubt there would have been scarcely a heart in realm that could have refused her request, nor any other world for that matter. And Benjamin, knowing why she asked, would not have refused her for all the gold in the South Innsbruck treasury. "You needn't but ask, my dear," said the prince, laying his big hand upon her head. Overjoyed, Fern snatched up the little dancer in her arms, and spun about with it. "Oh, thank you, brother," said Fern excitedly. She took the doll back up in her arms to appreciate its details in a way that you can only do with something you own. Not only was it perfect and special and beautiful, but now it was all hers as well. Then to get a good look at it she held out at arm's length. Then she brought it an inch from her eyes, carefully admiring the details in the face. With one hand she held it before her, and the other hand she used her little fingers to carefully trace its contours of the doll's face, but then she touched her own metal cheek. She sighed. For as much as she loved the doll for what it was still a reminder of what she was not, and never could be. But still it brought her more joy than pain, so she took it up in both arms again, hugged it dearly to her chest. Though she had intended to cheer up Abigail by visiting the wood dwarfs, it was Fern who cherished the visit the most. While Fern was admiring her figurine, Abigail noticed that the two dwarfs were whispering very loudly to each other. Amongst their arguing, Abigail heard a word she definitely had never heard before. Since she had no point of reference, she could only say what came into her mind when she heard the word, and that was terror. It made her think of the blackest night without a star in the sky, and of ancient woods long dead. But there was another feeling as well. The black night was not just black in color but also in a sense of ineffable wickedness or malice, so that as she thought upon the word a fear began to grow inside of her, so much so that every time she heard it afterwards it sent a chill down her spine. As their discussion grew louder, Abigail was not the only one who heard the word, which was repeated by Grandmother Dwarf multiple times. This time Benjamin and Fern had both heard it as well. Benjamin did nothing, but he looked very sad. Fern, at first, looked like she was doing nothing as well, but if you watched her closely, you could see that she began to wrap her little fingers around the doll tighter and tighter every time she heard them say that deplorable word. She squeezed the doll so tight that the wood began to crack sharply with every new twist of her wrist. At that moment, if she could have cried, hot, angry tears would be rolling down her cheeks as she stood there in silence, but, alas, she could not, so all of her anger remained burning deep inside of her. "Abigail, we are leaving, there is nothing for us here," said Fern in short stunted words, as someone trying very hard not to let their emotions come through their voice. Fern had already broke the little dancer into pieces, as the wood of the little doll still cracked under her grip. "These people don't know the first thing about the true spirit of Christmas, and their toys are just worthless rubbish," yelled Fern, throwing the little doll against the far wall, sending tiny pieces flying everywhere. Fern marched out of the carriage pulling Abigail by the arm, who was very confused. Meanwhile Benjamin went to speak to the two dwarves, who were quite dumbstruck at this point, and were unaware that they had been overheard. "I'm terribly sorry about this," he said as he approached the dwarves, but they recoiled in fear as he came closer. "Take whatever you want, just don't hurt us," whimpered Grandmother Dwarf, who was cowering with her husband. "We are leaving now, brother," yelled Fern from outside the cart. "This I hope will handle the damages," said the prince, laying 5 shks on the counter quickly and tipping his hat as an apology. "Brother, now," Fern said again. The rest of the ride into town was spent in silence, apart from Fern grumbling about the problem with wood dwarves in general and the pair of dwarves they met in particular. Abigail thought it might be a good idea to hide Ferdinand for a little while until Fern had calmed herself a bit. I'm afraid their time in the town was no less ambiguous. The townsfolk that knew Benjamin personally gave them a warm hello from their windows as they passed by, while others closed their shutters when they saw the cart, and she heard that word, that awful word, Blackwood, quite a few more times. Abigail thought they must be referring to her, since she did look uncannily like a dryad, but couldn't for the life of her figure out what that word had to do with her. Fern must be sticking up for me, she thought, which is awfully kind of her. What Abigail did not notice was that the prince's stature had shrunk as they came into town, usually proud and carefree, as the voices murmured and whispered to each other. He sat hunched over, making himself as small as possible. Most of the townsfolk were fox-kin, like the nobleman Abigail had seen on the road earlier, which was a general term for anyone that had noticeably big ears of the canine variety. There were also a good number of regular dwarves, who had been displaced from their homes up north, and a few unusuals since they were relatively close to a trade route. Benjamin and Fern were two of these unusuals. Also dispersed amongst the people, to Abigail's great astonishment, were quite a few dryads. Mostly they were standing out in front of the shops like living mannequins, or following behind people carrying heavy packs on their backs. "Do you see that? There are dryads everywhere. Don't people know they're dangerous?" said Abigail, alarmed. "I think deep down they know, they all know, but they believe they have tamed them," said Benjamin. "There is something deep in the soul of people that makes them want to take that which is dangerous, and instead of fleeing from it, or avoiding it, they attempt to rule over it and make it subject to their will, as if somehow it makes them more powerful." Abigail of course thought this was quite foolish, but the more she considered what the prince had said, the more she realized that the people of Realm and those of Earth were not that much different. About midway down the town's main thoroughfare, Abigail saw the shop they were heading for, Malaguth Theorem Athenaeum and Literary Consortium, or at least that is what the carved wooden sign above the door said in Atlantian. Even though this was carved in a universal language, it was so pompous and convoluted that it filled Abigail's head with important-sounding words that she was vaguely familiar with, but had only heard them in her vocabulary lessons. Nevertheless, the general idea was conveyed, that a very snooty individual must own this shop. As they came through the front door, a coiled brass bell rang out, alerting the owner that he had guests. This was a good thing too, because the shop was so lined with books in haphazard piles that once you wandered in more than 20 feet you couldn't even see the way out. The only area not steeped in books was the front counter, made of glass and oak. There were still books lying open all over it, but plenty of room was made for everyone to see a large ornate crest on the wall. It was a massive shield in blue and yellow, flanked on either side with some very intimidating dragons breathing fire below the shield, and another dragon that looked as if it was pouncing from behind it, with its claws out. The carved flames below the shield left enough room for a standard that said, "Here be dragons." It was obvious that it was there to intimidate or impress guests in the shop, but it was a bit overdone, so when Abigail saw it she couldn't help but laugh. This was mostly due to the fact that she didn't believe dragons existed, and she was far too old to be afraid of something that she considered make-believe. After the bell rang out they could hear something quickly scurrying through the book maze towards the front. Abigail thought she noticed a flash of something green and gold moving very quickly near the ground between the piles. While she was trying to figure out what that might have been, the scurrying creature crept quiet as a mouse along the base of the counter, and coiled himself around the front stool behind the counter. When Abigail turned back around, sitting on the stool, at about eye level, was a small dragon. He looked to be about 10 feet long but not very large at all, for those types of dragons are much longer than they are tall. It had scales of iridescent green and a belly of gold, and it looked like one of those Asian dragons that you might see in a book or on a vase. He was wearing some small spectacles and smoking a long ivory pipe. What do we have here?" he said in a deep rolling voice, and then added, "Benjamin, I did not take you as one so foolish as to own one of these creatures." "Malagarth theorem, say hello to Abigail," interjected Fern. "I do say, I see you've named it," said Malagarth theorem, condescendingly, then whispered to Benjamin, "My lad, this is quite unlike you. Are you sure you are in fair spirits?" "My old friend, I could not be in better ones. Do me a favor and take a closer look at our young guest, and I suppose you might see why my spirits are so high, and on top of that you should be able to guess the reason for visiting you as well," said the prince. Malagarth theorem, being the curious sort of dragon, did not waste any time with the invitation. He flowed over the counter and over towards the girl as smooth as a river. When he reached her he made his way around her dress, coiling himself like a garland on a Christmas tree. When he reached her hand he took it up in his and began saying things like hum and very interesting, but it was very obvious that he was covering for the fact that he had not really noticed anything at all. All of this happened quite quickly, so Abigail was still in a bit of shock at the fact that Malagarth theorem was wrapped around her waist and carefully studying her palms. Malagarth theorem weaved about her a few more times, stopping and studying this or that, or picking up her hair and studying it in the same way he had done her hands. Abigail was not keen towards the whole situation, but since she was completely entwined, and it appeared Malagarth theorem wasn't intent on doing her any harm, she stayed as still as possible. Benjamin leaned over to Abigail and in a whisper said, "I doubt the old coot has the slightest idea that you're not a dryad yet, and I intend to have a bit of fun with him over it." "So, Malagarth theorem, now I assume that it's obvious to you why we're here," said the prince. "Why yes, of course, blatantly obvious to anyone with half a brain. I feel even foolish mentioning it," scoffed Malagarth theorem. "Oh really, is that so?" said the prince, and then with a flick of the wrist loosed the clasp on the choker necklace that he had given Abigail earlier that day. "Then we won't be needing this," he said with a smirk. Malagarth theorem watched in horror as the necklace fell to the ground before him, the brass ring rattling as it hit the floor. Afraid to move anything but his eyes, he slowly tracked back to Abigail's eyes, which were now looking directly at him. Abigail saw for that brief second a look of absolute terror on his face. Then in a flash he unraveled her so quickly that it sent her spinning in the opposite direction. Unlike before when he moved as a graceful river, now it seemed that all of his parts were knotted and heaving away from her, trying to escape all at the same time, turning him into a scrambling, tangled mess. In his panic he knocked down a few piles of books. He made his way to the far wall, coughing up fire and fuming smoke as he went, like a tiny locomotive. With his arched back and teeth he looked much like a cat with its stander up, so Abigail was perfectly fine leaving him to his own business. Benjamin on the other hand was doubled over from the sight of it, unable to stop himself from laughing for quite some time afterwards. Oh, Malagarth theorem, you old duffer, you should see your face right now. Can't you see she's not a dryad at all? She's something completely different, something that hasn't been seen in this world in over an age. An image bearer, said the prince through laughs. Abigail thought that the prince's joke was, of course, a terribly mean thing to do to a friend, but to be fair, girls don't typically go in for those sorts of jokes anyway. An image bearer you say? Said Malagarth theorem, regaining his courage somewhat and looking Abigail intently in the eyes. Ah yes, now I see it. I suppose you're here to collect the book that you lent me a few months back, said Malagarth theorem. It's a shame, I was hoping you'd have forgotten about it and I could have added it to my collection. Dragons, of course, have an obsession with hoarding all sorts of useless things. Usually what they hoard typically depends on the particular breed. For example, the larger dragons usually have an affinity for hoarding gold, or chaste maidens. Some people still insist that dragons hoard gold due to their immense cupidity, but gold, in and of itself, is quite useless if everyone is too terrified to sell you anything, and I have yet to hear of a single bazaar that caters to dragon gold. Bookworms, on the other hand, as their name implies, are quite abnormally fond of books, but for a creature that breathes fire this interest can prove problematic to say the least. Said the prince, I'm afraid you cannot add my book to your collection just yet. It seems that I have need of it, but I promise that you can go right back to borrowing it the moment I'm done. All right then, just a moment, muttered Malagarth theorem, as he uncoiled the stool on which he once again was seated. Scurrying through his maze of books he finally came to the proper stack. After a few moments were taken to extricate the book in question, there was another bout of scurrying, and this time, Malagarth theorem appeared on the same side of the counter as the rest of the group, holding the book under his arm. With a heave he brought up the book, which was rather old and heavy, as most of books of any importance are, and he and Benjamin began to pore over it. Both studied the pages intently and took turns adding things like hum and I see to their review. Abigail was eagerly awaiting for them to announce they had discovered exactly how they were going to get her home, but Fern, who knew them both much better, was well aware that they were hours away from any meaningful conclusion, much less a plan. We'd best unpack our lunch now, for from what I know of those two I wouldn't expect more than hum out of them for the next few hours at least, said Fern. As Fern unpacked the lunch, Abigail decided to make a table and chair out of the books around her, and when she had finished, Fern covered it with a tablecloth they had brought with them, and prepared a setting of food before her. She also brought a plate for her brother and Malagarth theorem, but they were so engrossed in their research the only proof that they even noticed the plate was that when she came back later it was empty, apart from a few small crumbs. Fern was much more interested in spending time with Abigail to take any notice of their lack of courtesy. Besides, Fern knew all too well that any sort of niceties could hardly be expected from her brother once his mind was fixed on some new problem. However, with Abigail she pretended to be an attentive waiter in a fine establishment, and Abigail, of course, was her guest of high repute. My dearest lady, I have noticed your drink has run shallow, please allow me to refresh it for you, said Fern as she folded part of the tablecloth over her arm as a towel. Yes please, said Abigail, shaking her glass near her ear indicating her need of a refill, then added, and don't let it happen again or it will mean your job. Oh yes ma'am, I mean no of course not ma'am, responded Fern. So is my lady dining by herself this evening? Asked Fern. Of course not. Perish the thought, I am to meet my beloved Duke here shortly, make sure his place is set, said Abigail pompously. Oh yes, of course ma'am, how thoughtless of me, said Fern, setting another place at the table. Abigail brought out little Ferdinand, who she had been hiding in her dress pocket this whole time. Placing him on the plate, she gave him the tiny wedge of wooden cheese that came with him in his case. He sat on his hind legs and held it in front of his twitching nose, as if he was eating it, mostly out of habit I suppose. "Might I just say, ma'am, you two make quite the striking couple, so debonair and refined," said Fern. "Naturally, since we are gentry, and elegance is our burden to bear," said Abigail in a snooty voice, raising her little finger prominently. Ferdinand, meanwhile, was sniffing around his plate, stopping periodically to scratch behind his ears with his feet. They both agreed that he was the most darling little nobleman they had ever seen, and for a while they just sat and watched him resting their elbows on the table. After a while of quiet sitting, Abigail had a thought come to mind. It must be strange for him never to have to eat, or drink, or sleep, all those things that we spend so much time concerning ourselves with just to keep going, she said, and then became terribly embarrassed, worried that she might have hurt Fern's feelings. You never really notice how much time it takes until you don't have to do it anymore. Even though some people might see it as a waste of time, life feels hollow without it, said Fern bashfully. But what I miss more than anything is eating with people, not so much the food but the bond you have when you share a meal with someone. But wait, it's not all bad. I've seen you sleeping before. At least clockworks can sleep and dream of their past life, said Abigail, trying to cheer up Fern. No, I am the only one who sleeps and dreams, said Fern. My brother says it's because dreams are special and they reside in our hearts, and that proves that I'm special. As they were repacking the basket after their meal, Abigail asked Fern something that had been on her mind since that morning. Fern, I wanted to ask you something about something I heard when we were with the wood dwarves, began Abigail. Ugh, don't even get me started, I'm still cross over them, interrupted Fern. That's just it, I'm still confused what they did to make you so upset. And there's something else. I heard a word, a horrible word that I couldn't understand, but it made me feel something awful at the hearing of it. In my mind I pictured an ancient and dead tree on a cliff, twisted and writhing, and within it was a ghost whose soul was just as twisted in hatred and evil as the branches that surrounded it, said Abigail. Blackwood, said Fern angrily, for she wished that word never existed. Yes, that's the one. Whatever does it mean, and why would they call me that? Questioned Abigail. They weren't speaking of you, they were referring to Benjamin, said Fern, still sounding very upset over the whole matter. But why? Asked Abigail. Why would they say such things about Benjamin? He is the kindest, gentlest person I've met here. He really is that kind and more, said Fern distraughtedly. I know it for a fact. But some people cannot see past the outside of a person, or they refuse to, and judge him before ever giving him a chance to show how loving and tender-hearted he truly is. I know that we Deciduans do not have the best reputation in Beren, but if they were to just give him a chance. As they were speaking, Benjamin and Malagarth stepped from behind a rather tall stack of books to join them. Benjamin had his hat in his hands and he was running his fingers across the brim in a way that made it clear that the two had heard a good portion of the conversation regarding Blackwood, but didn't quite know how to step into it until just now. I am awfully sorry about this. I didn't mean you any offense by keeping this to myself. Honestly, I didn't, stammered the prince, but there never really is a good time to bring up such things. It's not as if I could say, hello there, welcome to our world. By the way, everyone who gets a good look at me thinks I'm some sort of despicable ghoul out to murder them. Fancy some tea? See, it wouldn't work at all, but that's the truth and all of it. Lad, interrupted Malagarth, I think it might be best that you share with our guest what you've already shared with me of your past. Especially since if what we have just read is accurate, she will have more than a casual influence on your future. It's all right, brother, Abigail is a good person, I know in my heart she will understand, said Fern. Very well, Abigail, said the prince, I will tell you of our past in Greenland, and of the War of Blackwoods, and how you are the key to what Fern and I have long searched for in this foreign land.